Hi guys, in this video, we take a look at implementing password hashing and sorting for a custom login system using Entity Framework for data access. Password hashing is the practice of using a hashing algorithm to encrypt a password. The resulting output of the encryption is called a hash value. Now, hashing is a one-way encryption. This makes it nearly impossible to reverse. Passwords are usually hashed during user registration before they can be stored to a database. This prevents anyone with unauthorized access to the database from knowing the actual plaintext password. During login, the input password is hashed, then compared with the stored hashed password in the database. If it matches, then access is granted. Sorting, on the other hand, is the concept of adding a unique value to a password before hashing it. The reason for this is to create a more sophisticated hash value. Now, this adds a layer of security to the hashing process. The sort is then stored to a database to be used for logging in. Now, with that being said, let's go to Visual Studio and get to the coding. Alright, so here in Visual Studio, I have a console application project set up, and I have the program.cs file open. Now, you might notice that I do not have the main method defined. The reason for that is I'm using .NET 6, which supports top-level statements. So that allows me to omit the main method while the code still remains valid. Now, the first step I'll be taking is I'll be adding the packages to the libraries I'll be using. Now, I'll be using Entity Framework Core for data access in this project. However, I already have these packages installed. So here in the project, I'll right-click and select Manage NuGet Packages. Now, under the Installed tab, you will notice that I have two packages installed. So I have Entity Framework Core SQL Server. So basically, this is SQL Server database provider for Entity Framework. Now, if you decide to use a different type of database, let's say for example SQLite, you have to download the Entity Framework Core SQLite package. Now, the second package is Entity Framework Core Tools. So what this package does is it allows me to execute commands in the package manager console, and these commands are going to facilitate data migrations. More on that later. Now, with that being said, I'll go ahead and close this. Now, in this project, I'll be demonstrating user login registration while implementing password hashing and sorting. So the first step is I'll create a class that will represent a user. So I'll go to the project, and I'll go to add class. I'll name this class user. Now I'm going to change this class to a public class. And in this class, I'm going to define properties associated with the user. So that's a name and a password. Now, because I'll be using Entity Framework to store these users to the database, it's a requirement that I have a property that defines the primary key. So I'm going to add another property to this class, and this property will be of the type integer. I'll name it ID. Now, to specify that this property will be a primary key, I'm going to decorate it with an attribute. And this attribute is called the key attribute, and it's defined in the data annotations namespace. So I'll add that namespace. Alright, so that's it for the user class. Now, Entity Framework is a mapping framework. So to access data and to establish a connection to the database, it makes use of a class called DB_context class. So it's through that class that we can establish connections to the database. So I'll create a class, and the class I'll create is going to inherit from the DB_context class. And this class is going to facilitate the mapping. So I'll go to the project, say add class. I'll name this class app data context. I'll change it to a public class. And I'll inherit from the DB_context class. The DB_context class is defined in the Entity Framework Core namespace. I'll add that namespace. Now, to configure this class, I'll call a method that's called the onConfiguring method. And this method is defined in the DB_context class. So what I'll do is I'll override this method. Now notice that this method passes a parameter called the DB context options builder. It is through this parameter that we can actually configure this class. So I'll say options builder, then I'll call a method called use SQL server. This method will take in the connection string to the database. Now I'll be using SQL local DB, so I can actually get the connection string right here in Visual Studio. So I'll go to view, then select SQL server object explorer. Then under SQL server, I'll select local DB. Now right here in the properties panel, we have a property called connection string. So I'll just copy the text and I'll paste it here as the parameter to the method. Now this connection string might contain irrelevant data, so I'll go ahead and get rid of some of it. So we have an error here. Now to get rid of that error, I'll just add the @ character at the beginning of the string. Now at this point, we have configured this object to connect to this database. Now in the connection string, we have the data source property, which specifies the saver, and we have the initial catalog, which specifies the database in that saver. Now I'll be changing this from master. I'll rename it to app. So we have this DB context configured to connect to this server. Now to map to the tables in the database, I'm going to add a property here of the type dbSet. Now this property allows me to specify a type that I'll be storing as an entity in the tables. And in this case, I'll be storing the user type. So add user. I'll name this property users. So basically this property is going to map to the users table. Now with the app data context class set up, I'm now going to initiate data migrations. So I'll go to tools, then I'll go to package manager console. Now in the package manager console, I'm going to run certain commands. So the first command is the add migration command. So this command is going to add a migration. So basically a migration is just some piece of code that's going to be executed to create a database based on what we have defined in the app data context class here. I'm going to name this migration mg1 and I'll run the command. Alright, so the command ran successfully. Now notice that we have a folder called migrations, and in that folder we have some code here that was generated. So basically this code is going to be executed to create a database and the necessary tables. So close this. I'm going to run the command, that's the update database command. And this command is going to commit these changes to the database. Alright, so the command ran successfully. So at this point, we now have the database configured to map to what we specified here. To verify that, I can go to View, SQL Server, Object Explorer. Then right here, in LocalDB, I'll expand this. Then I'll also expand databases. I'll just refresh this. Notice that under databases, we now have a database called app. If I expand this and view the tables, you will notice that there's a table called users, and this table will be mapping to this property here. So go ahead and close this. Now here in the program.cs file, I'm going to implement user login and registration while implementing password hashing and sorting. So I'll get rid of this line of code. And what I'll do is I'll add some using statements here. So right now I have the namespace specified here, which is the hash and sorting namespace. And this is just the namespace of this project. This will allow me to access the objects like the app data context object and the user context. Now I'm going to add another namespace. So I'll say using system.text. Then I'm going to add a using static directive. So basically what this is going to do, it will allow me to omit certain names when calling static methods. Now the reason I'm going to do this is because I'll be using a lot of console.write, console.read methods. So I'm going to say using, then I'll say static, I'll say system, then I'll call the console class. So basically this allows me to use the static methods that are defined in this console class without actually specifying console. So for example, if I want to write to the screen, I can just say write line instead of saying console.writeLine. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to define 4 methods here. So the first method I'm going to define is the prompt method. So I'm going to implement code in the prompt method to prompt the user on whether to log in or register a new user. Another method will be the login method. Then a register method. And lastly, I'm going to add in a hash password method. This method will return a string and it will take in a string as a parameter as well. So I'll start by implementing the hash password method. Now I have a namespace specified here, which is the systems security cryptography. So I'll be using a class here called the SHA-256, and this class has certain methods that I'll be using to hash the string here. So I'll say SHA-256. SHA stands for Secure Hashing Algorithm 256. And I'll say hash is equal to SHA-256 then I'll call the create method. So this create method will return an instance of the SHA class. Now it's on this instance that I can call another method, and that method is called the compute hash method. Now you might think that this method would just take in a string and then hash it. However, this method only takes in bytes, and this is an array of bytes. So I'll now change this string into an array of bytes. So I'll use the encoding class. So I'll say encoding. And I'll say get the default encoding. Then on this encoding, I'll call the get byte method. And this byte method will take in a string and then return an array of bytes. So I'll pass it the password. And I'll save it to a variable. I'll say password bytes. Now once I have the bytes of the password, I'll now pass them to the compute hash method. And once they are computed and a hash is created, it's going to return an array of bytes of the hashed value. So I now need to convert this array of bytes into a string. So I'll save this to a variable. Then I'll say hashed password Then I'm going to use a method on the convert class. So I'll say convert. And this method is the 2-hex string. This method takes in an array of bytes as well. So I'll get the bytes of the hashed password. then paste it there. And this will be converted to hexadecimal string. Then I'll return this value. Alright, so that's it for the hash password method. Now the next step is I'm going to implement the prompt method. So inside the prompt method, the first step I'll take is I'll clear the console if at all there's anything written. So I'll call the clear method. Then I'll write to the console to prompt the user to log in or to register a user. So I'll say R means to register and L is to log in. So I'll be expecting an input from the console. So I'll save this input to a variable. So I'll say input is equal to console read. So I'll just call the read method here, read line in fact. And whatever will be written, I'll convert that to uppercase. And once it's converted to uppercase, I'm only going to get the character at the first index. A string is an array of characters, so I just want the character at the first index, just in case the user types in multiple strings. So I'll do that through an index. Now, once I have the value, I'm now going to call a while loop. So inside this while loop, I'll now examine the returned value. So what I'm going to do is I'll use a switch statement. In fact, I'll place this in the while loop. And in the switch statement, I'm going to evaluate the input value. So for the first case, I'll examine the character. If it's R, then I'll call the register method. Then I can break out of the switch. Then for the second case, so I'll just copy this and paste. If it's L, then I'll call the login method. Alright, so that's it for the prompt method. Now what I'm going to do is I'll go to the register method and implement this method. So the first step is to prompt the user that they're in login mode. So what I'll do is I'll first clear the console. Then I'll write. And I'll write to indicate that they're in register mode. So say register. Then I'll prompt the user to input a username. So say username. Then I'll be expecting a value. So I'll save that to the name variable. So I'll say read line. So I'll do the same for the password. So I'll just copy this and paste. That's the password. And I'll store that to the password variable. Now that I have the name and the password, I can now create a user and save that user to the database. So I'll use the using statement. Then I'll say app data context. And I'll just name it context, and I'll create an instance. So the app data context will allow us to connect to the database. So I'll create a new instance. Now remember that this will be mapping to the database, so it's through this object that we can actually map to the users table. Okay, so I'm going to now call, I'll say context, then I'll access the users table through the property users, then I'll say add, and this method will take in a new user. So I'll create a new user and I'll specify the properties here. So I'll specify the name property, and this name property will be equal to the name here that was passed in through the console. So I'll say name and then password. Now for the password, we won't save the plain text password. It is at this point that we are going to hash the password and save it in the hashed form. Now I'm going to say variable, then I'll say hashed password is equal to hash password. So I'll call the function, then I'll pass it the password text here, and it's going to return a hashed password and save it to this variable. It is now that I'm going to use that variable and store it to the database. So I'll say hash password. All right, so at this point we have the user registered. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a while loop, and inside this while loop I'm going to use an if statement. Now first I'm going to prompt the user, so I'm going to say, I'm going to write to the console, so I'll say write line, and I'm going to write registration complete. And after writing that, I'm going to prompt the user to press a key. And this is the big key to go back. So I'm going to call the read line method. In fact, I'll call the read key method, and I'll get the key based on whatever the user is going to click. Then here, if that key is equal to the big key, if that key is equal to the big key, then we can go back to the prompt screen. So I'll call the prompt method here. So that will take us back to the prompt method. Now in case the user clicks on a wrong key, we are going to run through this loop again. So it is at this point that I would want to clear the screen. So just here, I'll call the clear method. All right. Now after we have the user added here through the context class, we now need to commit the changes to the database. So I'll call another method. I'll say context, then I'll say save changes. So this will save the changes to the database. Okay. Now at this point, I'm now going to implement the login method. So I'll just copy this and paste it here. Now we're going to first clear the screen, then prompt the user that they are in login mode. Now before the user logs in, the user needs to verify that the actual user exists. So the application will first look for the user. So I'll say context, then users, then I'll call the any method. So this will check if there is any user whose name equals the name that was specified in the console. And this method will return a boolean. I'll save that boolean to a variable, and I'll call this user found. Now I'll use an if statement. If the user is found, so I'll say if user found is true, we can proceed with the login. Now I'll call the context object again. So I'll say context, then I'll access the users table. Then I'll say first or default. So this will return the first user with that name. So once that user is returned, what I'll do is I'll create a variable. I'll save that user to a variable. So I'll say login user. I'll use another if statement in there. So I'll say if the user that has this name, I'll get the password and compare it to the password here. So I'll say hash password. Then I'll pass it the password that the user input in the console. If this hashed password is equal to the password stored in this user, so I'll say login user. Then I'll get the password. If these two passwords are equal, so basically if the password that the user input during login is the same as the password stored, then we can write to the console. In fact, I'll first clear the console. Then I'll say so I'll write to the console and say log in login successful. Now I might want to change the color of the font of the text in the console, so I'll just say foreground color. Now remember, I'm just using static properties here because I had it defined here. So I'll equate this to console color, then I'll say green to indicate that we are logged in. So once we are logged in, then I'll just say read line. Now if it's the wrong password, I'll clear the console, change the text to red, then I'll just say login failed, and that should do it. Alright, so I'll go ahead and test the application. Now notice that we have the application and immediately the application runs and closes. The reason for that is we've only created the methods here, but we haven't called any of these methods. So I'm only going to call one method, and that is the prompt method here. Then I'll run the application again. Alright, so here we are asked to log in or register, so I'll click register. Then I'll specify the username as Jamie and the password as Jamie as well. Alright, registration complete, and it asks me to go back. So I'll press B, and this time I'm going to try to log in. So I'll say Jamie and password Jamie, and it says login successful. Alright, so let's go and view the data in the database. So right here in the users table, I'm going to view the data. Alright, now notice we have a user with the name Jamie, but the password is not Jamie. It's a hashed version of Jamie. So if anyone has access to the database, they do not know what password is specified here. They do not know the plain text password. So that's the first step, which is password hashing. Now, what I'm going to implement is password sorting. So I'll be adding a unique value to the password before I can store it to the database. So right here in the register method, before I store the hashed password to the database, I'll be adding a unique value, all right, to create a more sophisticated hash value. So what I'll do is I'll go to the user class here. I'm going to add another property. And this will be of the type string. And I'll name this property sort. All right, now that I have modified this class, I also need to modify the tables in the database, and that can be easily done. So I'll go to Tools, then I'll click Package Manager Console. Now I'm going to run another add migration command. So I'll say add migration, and I'll name it mg2. So basically, because I have updated the model here, I can now create another migration and execute the changes. So this is going to update the tables. So execute that command. All right, so we have the new code generated, and notice that inside this code we have a method called add column. So basically what we are doing, we're just modifying the table in the database by adding a new column named sort here. So what I'm going to do is I'll commit these changes to the database by running the update database command. So I'll say update database. All right, so the command was successful. Now that we know that our model here and the database table matches, we know that the mapping will be easy and won't have any issues. So I'll close this. I'll go back to the program.cs file here. So it's right here in the register method that I'm going to now modify some code. So what I'll be doing to add the sort to the password, I'll be using a timestamp. So I'm going to create a variable, and I'll name this variable sort. Now I'll be using a timestamp, so I'll say datetime, then .now, so I'll get the current time, then I'll change it to a string, and this will be our sort. Now here, when hashing the password, I'm going to add it here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use string interpolation. So I'll add a string, then place a $sign at the beginning of the string. So I'll concat this string, so I'm going to add the password here. Then I'll add the sort. So the password and the sort combined will now be saved to the database. So that's a sorted password. Now I'll go back to the login method here. Now inside this login method, I have to ensure that I can retrieve the sort back from the database, then use that sort to verify. Okay, so here I have a login user. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to specify here that the password that the user has specified here combined with the sort. So I'll use string interpolation. So I'll say the password specified by the user and the sort saved in the login user, which is retrieved from the database. So I'll get the sort. If that equals to the stored password in the database, then grant access. So basically what's happening here, I get the user, then I get its password, then I compare it to the password plus its sort here. So if the password specified combined with the sort that's stored in the database equals the stored password, then grant access. All right, so that's it. So I'll go ahead and test the code. Now, just before I can test the code, I forgot one thing. in the register method here, I also need to store the salt to the database. So while adding a new user here, I need to specify that the user's salt is equal to this salt that we created, and we were using a timestamp here, so I'll say salt. So I'll go ahead and now test the application. All right, so I'm going to select register, and I'm going to register the name as Mike. For the password, I'll use the same as the previous password, so I'll say Jamie. And we have registration complete. So I'll go back, then I'm going to type in L for login, then I'll say Mike, then Jamie for the password. Login successful. Now let's go and view the data in the database. So here I'll click on view data. All right, now we have a salt specified in the second user, and that's the time we created that user. Now one thing you'll notice is that I used the name Jamie and Mike, but I used the same password. However, the hashed result is different, and the reason is because we added a salt to the password. So if somebody hacks into your data server and they have access to your databases, they have no way of actually knowing that these two passwords are the same, and that's the result of adding a salt. And the salt has to be unique. So in this case, I use the timestamp because I know that you have different timestamps. All right, so that's it for password hashing and salting in .NET. Remember to like and subscribe to this YouTube channel. I'll see you in the next one.